It was a warm Saturday afternoon at Greenfield Park, and everything seemed perfect. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its golden glow over the bustling park. Families spread colorful blankets across the grassy fields, their picnic baskets brimming with sandwiches, fresh fruits, and bottles of lemonade. Children raced around with boundless energy, their laughter ringing through the air like cheerful bells. On the paved paths winding through the park, joggers moved in steady rhythm, their sneakers crunching softly against the gravel as they passed. Even the gentle rustling of leaves in the slight breeze added to the serene atmosphere. Near the center of it all was a peaceful pond, its surface shimmering like glass under the sunlight. Ducks glided gracefully across the water, occasionally quacking as they paddled. Nearby, a man sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, his figure blending into the scenery as if he were part of the background. He wore simple clothes, a pair of faded jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a baseball cap that looked like it had seen better days. The cap was pulled low over his face, shielding him from the bright sun and, perhaps, from curious eyes. In his hands, he held a crinkled paper bag filled with breadcrumbs, tossing small pieces into the pond one at a time. The ducks eagerly swam closer, quacking and pecking at the water to snatch up the crumbs. To anyone passing by, the man was just another park visitor enjoying a quiet afternoon. There was nothing remarkable about him, nothing that stood out. People barely noticed him, and those who did spared only a brief glance before moving on. That was exactly what he wanted. He liked being invisible, blending into the crowd, and letting the world move around him without interruption. But this man wasn't ordinary. His name was Jack Rowe, though he rarely used it these days. Jack had lived a life most people couldn't imagine, a life filled with danger, secrets, and decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. He was a retired Special Forces operative, a man trained to handle situations that most would consider impossible. Jack had been to places no one could find on a map and faced enemies who would give anyone nightmares. Yet here he was, feeding ducks at a park, trying to find a sliver of peace in a world he once fought to protect. The park had become a refuge for Jack in recent weeks. He came here almost every day, choosing the same bench by the pond. It was a quiet spot, far enough from the playground and the main trails to avoid the busiest crowds. He liked the sound of the water and the soft chatter of families in the distance. It reminded him of simpler times before everything in his life had become so complicated. Jack didn't talk much to anyone. Occasionally, a child might wander up, curious about the ducks, and he would offer a small smile or hand them a few breadcrumbs to throw. Once or twice, an elderly man walking his dog had nodded in his direction and exchanged a polite good afternoon. But for the most part, Jack kept to himself. He wasn't looking for friends or conversation. He just wanted to sit quietly, unnoticed, and let the world pass him by. Despite his outward calm, Jack's mind was rarely still. Memories from his past crept in like uninvited guests, playing on a loop in his thoughts. He could see the faces of teammates he had lost, hear the echoes of missions gone wrong, and feel the weight of decisions he had made under pressure. No matter how far he tried to run from it, his past was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to remind him of who he used to be. Jack didn't regret his time in the Special Forces, not entirely. He had done things that needed to be done, protected lives, and served his country with honor. But it had come at a cost. He had given up his peace of mind, his sense of normalcy, and, in many ways, his future. Now, all he wanted was a quiet life, free from the chaos and danger that had defined him for so long. As he sat there, tossing another piece of bread into the pond, Jack thought about how strange life could be. A man who had once traveled to the most remote and dangerous corners of the world now found comfort in something as simple as feeding ducks. It was almost laughable, but Jack didn't mind. He was grateful for the small moments of peace he could find, even if they felt fleeting. But peace, as Jack knew all too well, was fragile. It was the kind of thing you could hold onto for a little while, but not forever. And today, peace wasn't on the agenda. It started suddenly, a low rumble in the distance, faint but distinct. Jack's ears perked up. Years of training had sharpened his senses to a fine point, and he recognized the sound immediately. Motorcycles. Several of them. The noise grew louder as the motorcycles approached, their engines roaring like thunder. Jack didn't turn his head, but his body tensed ever so slightly. His hand paused mid-throw, a breadcrumb dangling between his fingers. The bikers came into view, 5 of them in total, riding in a tight formation. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in leather jackets with patches and logos stitched onto the back. The largest patch bore a flaming skull, surrounded by the words Iron Reapers. Jack had heard of them before. The Iron Reapers were a notorious biker gang that had been making their way through small towns and cities, leaving trouble in their wake. They thrived on intimidation, picking fights, and causing chaos wherever they went. The gang rumbled into the park's parking lot, their engines growling as they dismounted. They laughed loudly, their voices carrying across the open space. Families turned to look, some with curiosity, others with unease. Jack remained still, his gaze fixed on the pond as if he hadn't noticed the commotion. But he was aware of every detail: the way the gang moved, their loud voices, and the way they scanned the park as if they were looking for something or someone. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the crinkled bag of breadcrumbs. He had come here for peace, but trouble had a way of finding him, no matter where he went. The gang wasn't subtle. They parked their motorcycles haphazardly, their engines sputtering one last defiant roar before they cut off. The air around them seemed to shift, once warm and light-hearted, now tinged with unease. The laughter of children grew quieter, and parents began to murmur, their eyes darting toward the newcomers. One biker, tall and wiry with a scruffy beard, stretched his arms overhead, cracking his knuckles. "Nice place," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Real, peaceful." The leader of the group, a massive man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his left cheek, gave a toothy grin. Rex, as he was called, exuded a raw, menacing energy. He scanned the park with a look that made people instinctively turn away. Rex tugged off his leather gloves and slapped them against his palm as he strode toward the pond. His boots crunched against the gravel path, each step deliberate and heavy. The other bikers followed, fanning out like wolves circling prey. Jack didn't move. He watched the ducks, his hand rhythmically tossing crumbs into the water. His face was impassive, calm, and unreadable. It wasn't the first time he'd felt trouble brewing, and he knew better than to react too soon. "You see that guy over there?" Rex's voice boomed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He wasn't talking to Jack, not directly, but making sure he had an audience. "Sitting all alone, throwing bread to ducks like some kind of weirdo." The bikers chuckled, their laughter grating and sharp. One of them, a stocky man with a bandana tied around his head, added, "Hey, maybe he's waiting for his mommy to pick him up." More laughter followed. A few park-goers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of whether to step in or stay out of it. Most chose the latter, edging away slowly. Jack, for his part, didn't even flinch. He tossed another crumb into the water, his eyes following the ripples as the ducks fought over the small morsels. Rex took another step closer, his boots stopping just at the edge of Jack's peripheral vision. "Hey, old man," he said, his tone shifting to something more confrontational. "I'm talking to you." Jack turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Rex's gaze. His expression was neutral, his eyes calm but focused. "And?" he asked simply. The single word hung in the air, its quiet delivery somehow cutting through the noise. Rex's grin faltered for a split second before he recovered, his bravado kicking back in. "And," Rex said, leaning in slightly, "you're in our spot." Jack raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at the empty benches scattered around the park. "Plenty of spots," he replied, turning back to the ducks. "Take your pick." The bikers bristled. Rex's grin twisted into something more sinister, and he stepped closer, his shadow falling over Jack. "You've got a smart mouth for a guy sitting all alone," he said. Jack's fingers tightened slightly around the paper bag, but he kept his movements slow, unthreatening. "Just here to feed the ducks," he said evenly. "No need to make it more than that." Rex chuckled, shaking his head as if Jack had just told a joke. "Oh, I think we're way past that," he said, turning to his gang. "Don't you think, boys?" The other bikers grinned and nodded, their postures shifting to something more aggressive. One of them, a lanky man with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, cracked his knuckles loudly. "Yeah," he said. "Way past that." Jack exhaled quietly, setting the bag of breadcrumbs down beside him. He had been here before, not in this exact situation, but in moments like it. Moments where trouble came looking for him, and he had no choice but to respond. He didn't want this. Not here, not now. But he also knew that trying to de-escalate wasn't always an option. Some people didn't back down, no matter how calm or reasonable you were. The air around the pond felt heavier, the earlier sounds of laughter and chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. The bikers had drawn a small audience, now families lingering at a safe distance, their faces etched with concern. Rex took another step forward, towering over Jack. "Last chance, old man," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Move, or we'll move you." Jack finally stood, rising slowly from the bench. He was taller than he looked sitting down, his broad shoulders and straight posture suddenly more apparent. He adjusted his baseball cap, pulling it down slightly before meeting Rex's gaze again. "You sure you want to do this?" Jack asked, his tone calm but firm. Rex blinked, caught off guard by the question. Then he laughed, a short, barking sound that was quickly echoed by his gang. "Oh, I'm sure," he said, stepping even closer. Jack nodded slowly, almost as if he were agreeing. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his stance relaxed but balanced. "All right," he said quietly. "Your call." The moment hung in the air, the tension so thick it felt like the whole park was holding its breath. The low growl of motorcycle engines shattered the tranquility of Greenfield Park like an approaching storm. Families that had been laughing moments earlier paused to glance toward the parking lot, their smiles fading into cautious curiosity. 5 motorcycles, their chrome glinting under the sun, rolled in side by side, their riders commanding attention without needing to say a word. The bikers were a rough-looking bunch, clad in leather jackets that bore the emblem of a flaming skull. The words Iron Reapers arched menacingly above the design. They were a gang known for making their presence felt wherever they went, and not in a good way. In every town they passed through, whispers of vandalism, intimidation, and outright violence followed in their wake. Their leader was a hulking man named Rex, whose mere appearance was enough to put people on edge. His shaved head gleamed under the sunlight, and a long scar carved its way down his cheek, giving him an almost sinister grin even when he wasn't smiling. But Rex was smiling now, a wide, toothy grin that suggested he had already picked his next target. Rex climbed off his bike, tossing his leather gloves onto the seat before scanning the park with a predator's eyes. To him, the park was a hunting ground, and everyone there was prey. He relished the way people avoided his gaze, the way parents hurried their children along or shifted nervously on their picnic blankets. Power, Rex believed, wasn't just about physical strength, it was about making people afraid of you before you even said a word. Behind him, his crew dismounted, moving with the confidence of men who knew no one would dare challenge them. Each of them had their own air of menace. Snake, a wiry man with a tattoo of a coiled serpent snaking up his neck; Brick, whose massive build matched his name; Bandana, whose ever-present headgear and sharp eyes gave him a shifty, calculating look, and Tiny a nickname as ironic as they came, given his towering height and broad shoulders. The gang spread out slightly, their movements casual but calculated. They weren't just there to enjoy the scenery, they were there to make sure everyone knew the Iron Reapers had arrived. Rex's eyes locked onto Jack, still seated on the bench by the pond. To most, Jack appeared unremarkable, just a quiet man feeding ducks. But to Rex, something about him seemed off. Maybe it was the way Jack hadn't looked up when the bikes roared in, or the way he sat so still, his body language calm yet somehow alert. Rex didn't like it. "Hey, old man." Rex's voice cut through the park like a whip, loud enough to make people flinch. Heads turned toward him, conversations dying mid-sentence. Jack finally glanced up, his face impassive. His gaze met Rex's without a hint of fear or irritation. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice steady and even. Rex sauntered forward, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. His crew followed a step behind, spreading out slightly as they approached the pond. "Yeah," Rex sneered, motioning toward the bench. "You're in our spot." Jack raised an eyebrow, glancing around at the other empty benches scattered throughout the park. "There's plenty of benches around," he said calmly. "You don't need this one." The bikers laughed, a low, mocking sound that carried a promise of trouble. Snake spat onto the ground, shaking his head as if amused by the exchange. "Looks like we got ourselves a smart guy," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Rex stopped a few feet from Jack, looming over him like a thundercloud about to burst. "Listen," he said, his tone laced with menace. "I don't like repeating myself. Move, or we'll move you." Jack didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his arms resting on the back of the bench as if settling in for a conversation. "This bench doesn't have your name on it," he said, his tone casual. "If you want it, you're going to have to wait your turn like everyone else." The gang's laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. Rex's grin faltered for the briefest moment before returning, wider and meaner than before. "You've got guts, old man," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Stupid, but gutsy." Tiny stepped forward, cracking his neck as he loomed beside Rex. "Want me to handle this, boss?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling like an earthquake. Rex raised a hand, stopping Tiny in his tracks. "Not yet," he said, his eyes never leaving Jack. "I want to see what this guy's made of." Jack sighed softly, lowering his hands to rest them on his knees. "Look," he said, his voice still calm but with a slight edge now. "I'm not looking for trouble. I came here to enjoy the afternoon, same as you. Why don't you take one of those other benches and let everyone enjoy their day?" Rex's grin disappeared entirely, replaced by a scowl. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he said, his voice rising. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack tilted his head slightly, studying Rex with a calm intensity that seemed to unnerve even the gang leader. "And you don't know who you're dealing with," Jack replied evenly. The tension was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. The onlookers who had been trying to act casual were no longer pretending. Parents pulled their children closer, and joggers paused mid-stride, their eyes flicking nervously between Jack and the bikers. Snake let out a low whistle, his tattooed neck twisting as he glanced between Rex and Jack. "Boss, this guy's got a death wish," he said, grinning. Rex ignored him, his focus entirely on Jack. "You've got 10 seconds to get up and walk away," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "After that, we're doing this the hard way." Jack remained still, his gaze locked on Rex. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched, his expression unreadable. 1 second. 2. 3. Rex's patience snapped. "All right, tough guy," he said, stepping forward and grabbing the edge of the bench. "Let's see how tough you really are." Before Rex could finish his sentence, Jack moved. Jack's calm demeanor didn't falter as Rex gripped the bench, his muscles flexing in an attempt to physically assert control. For a moment, it seemed like Jack might concede. His hand shifted slightly, as if he were preparing to stand. But instead of moving away, Jack adjusted his posture, planting both feet firmly on the ground. "I wouldn't do that," Jack said quietly, his voice low but firm. The words stopped Rex mid-motion, his hands still gripping the bench. For a brief moment, he hesitated, thrown off by Jack's tone. It wasn't a plea or a threat, it was a warning, delivered with the kind of certainty that couldn't be ignored. Tiny frowned, stepping closer to Rex. "This guy serious?" he asked, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Jack. Rex barked a laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, he's serious, all right," he said, releasing the bench and stepping back. "But I don't think he gets how this works. Let me explain it to you, old man. When I say move, you move. That's how it works around here." Jack's gaze shifted to Tiny for a moment, then back to Rex. "And if I don't?" he asked. Rex grinned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Then we make you." The other bikers closed in slightly, creating a loose circle around Jack. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that made onlookers instinctively take a step back. Snake, always eager to escalate, crouched slightly as he circled to Jack's side. "Bet he's just bluffing," Snake muttered, his snake tattoo shifting with the movement. "Let me show him why that's a bad idea." Jack turned his head just enough to meet Snake's gaze, his expression still unreadable. "Bluffing, huh?" Jack said. "You really want to find out?" The challenge in Jack's voice sent a ripple through the group. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried a weight that made even Snake pause. "Enough talk," Rex growled, his patience finally wearing thin. "Snake, handle him." Snake grinned, stepping forward and cracking his knuckles. He moved with a cocky swagger, clearly expecting little resistance from the man sitting on the bench. "All right, Grandpa," Snake said, rolling his shoulders. "Let's see what you've got." Jack didn't move until the very last second. As Snake lunged forward, Jack's hand shot out, catching Snake's wrist mid-swing. The movement was so fast, so precise, that it left Snake blinking in confusion. For a moment, Snake tried to pull free, but Jack's grip was like steel. With a quick twist, Jack redirected Snake's momentum, sending him stumbling forward and crashing into the edge of the bench. Snake yelped in pain, clutching his side as he rolled onto the ground. The park fell silent. The other bikers froze, their confidence faltering as they processed what had just happened. Jack rose to his feet slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. He adjusted his baseball cap, then looked directly at Rex. "I warned you," he said simply. Rex's grin was gone now, replaced by a scowl. "Lucky shot," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed his unease. Tiny cracked his knuckles, stepping forward. "Let me take care of him," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "Stay back," Rex snapped, raising a hand to stop Tiny. His pride wouldn't let him hand this over to someone else, not yet. "You think you're tough?" Rex said, stepping closer to Jack. "Let's see how tough you are when it's not just a scrawny guy like Snake." Jack didn't respond. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but ready. It wasn't the stance of someone preparing for a fight, it was the stance of someone who had fought more times than he cared to count. Rex lunged, his fists swinging with brute force. But brute force, Jack knew, was no match for precision. Jack sidestepped the first swing, his movements fluid and economical. As Rex's second punch came, Jack deflected it with a quick block, using Rex's own momentum to spin him off balance. Before Rex could recover, Jack delivered a single, Well-placed strike to Rex's side, a sharp jab that knocked the wind out of him. Rex stumbled, clutching his ribs as he gasped for air. The onlookers gasped, murmurs spreading through the small crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence eroding with every passing second. Brick, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Boss, you okay?" he asked, his deep voice laced with concern. Rex waved him off, straightening with a visible effort. "I'm fine," he growled, though the pain in his voice was clear. Jack took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the group. "This doesn't have to go any further," he said. "Take your friend and leave." Tiny crossed his arms, his massive frame tense. "You really think we're just gonna walk away after that?" he said, his tone equal parts disbelief and anger. Jack tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I think you should," he said. Rex wiped his mouth, his scar twisting into an ugly sneer. "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No one embarrasses me and gets away with it." He turned to the rest of his crew, his tone sharp. "Take him." The bikers hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving in unison, surrounding Jack from all sides. Each step they took radiated menace, their earlier bravado replaced by a cold determination. Jack exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing at his sides. He didn't want this, not here, not now, but he wasn't going to back down. Years of training and experience had taught him one thing above all else: when the fight comes to you, you end it. The first strike came from Tiny, a lumbering punch that could have flattened anyone else. But Jack wasn't just anyone. He sidestepped the blow, delivering a sharp elbow to Tiny's midsection before spinning to block an incoming kick from Bandana. The fight unfolded like a choreographed dance, each movement precise and deliberate. Jack moved with a speed and efficiency that left the bikers scrambling to keep up. A kick here, a block there, every action calculated to neutralize the threat without wasting energy. Within moments, the gang was on the defensive, their attacks growing sloppier as their frustration mounted. Snake, still nursing his earlier injury, tried to catch Jack off guard but found himself on the receiving end of a swift takedown that left him gasping for breath. By the time the dust settled, the Iron Reapers were either on the ground or leaning against their bikes, battered and humiliated. Rex was the last to rise, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. Jack stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing steady, his expression calm. He looked at Rex one last time, his voice firm but quiet. "I told you to leave," he said. Rex glared at him, his fists clenching and unclenching. For a moment, it looked like he might charge again, but then he looked around, taking in the state of his crew and the growing crowd of witnesses. "This isn't over," Rex spat, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any threat could. Rex motioned for his gang to retreat, and one by one, they climbed back onto their bikes. The roar of their engines filled the air as they sped out of the park, leaving behind a trail of dust and uneasy murmurs. Jack watched them go, his body still tense, his mind already scanning the area for potential threats. But as the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, he allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. The onlookers began to disperse, some murmuring their thanks, others too shaken to speak. Jack didn't acknowledge them. He walked back to the bench, picked up the bag of breadcrumbs, and resumed feeding the ducks as if nothing had happened. The bikers exchanged glances, a mix of confusion and annoyance flickering across their faces. Jack's calm demeanor unnerved them, but their pride wouldn't let them back down. Rex stepped closer, his fists clenched tightly. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Jack met Rex's glare with an unflinching gaze. "Neither will arrogance," he replied. Rex barked a short laugh, though it lacked the confidence it had before. "We'll see about that." Tiny moved first, his massive frame lurching forward with surprising speed. He swung a meaty fist toward Jack, aiming to end the fight with one powerful blow. Jack sidestepped effortlessly, his movements smooth and deliberate, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. Tiny stumbled slightly, thrown off balance by the miss. Jack didn't strike back. He merely watched, his stance relaxed but ready, as if waiting for the next move. "Get him!" Rex barked, his voice laced with frustration. The bikers hesitated for a moment, their bravado faltering. But Rex's glare pushed them forward. Snake and Bandana moved in tandem, attempting to corner Jack. Snake lunged first, his movements aggressive but sloppy. Jack parried the attack, redirecting Snake's momentum with a sharp twist of his arm. Snake let out a pained yelp as he crashed to the ground. Bandana swung a metal chain he'd pulled from his belt, the links glinting in the sunlight. Jack ducked under the swing, closing the distance between them with a quick step. Before Bandana could react, Jack delivered a precise strike to his wrist, forcing him to drop the chain. Jack caught the chain mid-air and tossed it aside. "You'll hurt someone with that," he said, his tone almost scolding. Tiny charged again, this time using his full weight to try and tackle Jack. But Jack anticipated the move, stepping aside at the last second and using Tiny's momentum against him. Tiny stumbled forward and hit the ground hard, the impact shaking the nearby bench. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold with a mix of awe and fear. Whispers rippled through the group. "Who is that guy? Did you see how fast he moved? He's not just some old man." Rex's face turned crimson with rage. "What are you all doing?" he shouted at his crew. "Get up and finish this." But the bikers were slower to rise this time, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Jack took a step back, giving them room. "It doesn't have to end like this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Walk away while you still can." Rex sneered, his fists trembling. "Not a chance." He lunged at Jack with everything he had, throwing a wild punch aimed at Jack's head. Jack dodged with ease, grabbing Rex's arm and twisting it behind his back. The movement was quick and controlled, leaving Rex immobilized and gasping in pain. "Let it go," Jack said quietly, his voice calm but commanding. Rex struggled, his pride refusing to let him submit. But Jack applied a bit more pressure, and Rex let out a strained grunt. "Okay. Okay." Rex spat, his voice tight with pain. Jack released him and stepped back, his posture calm and unthreatening. "Enough," he said. "It's over." But Rex wasn't ready to give up. He stumbled to his feet, glaring at Jack with venom in his eyes. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he snarled. "We'll see how tough you are when." Before Rex could finish, a voice cut through the tension. "Rex, stop." The crowd turned to see a woman approaching, her presence commanding attention. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She wore a leather jacket similar to the bikers, but hers bore a different emblem, a silver eagle. "Lila," Rex said, his bravado faltering. Lila walked straight up to Rex, her gaze piercing. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Rex shifted uncomfortably. "We were just making fools of yourselves," Lila interrupted, her tone icy. She turned to the rest of the bikers, her expression hard. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" The bikers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. Jack raised an eyebrow, curious but silent. Lila turned to Jack, her demeanor softening slightly. "I'm sorry about this," she said. "They don't know any better." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "And you do?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I've heard of you. Jack Rowe, right?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "Jack Rowe? The name sounds familiar. Wasn't he in the military? Special Forces, I think. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Lila looked at the bikers, her expression stern. You're lucky he went easy on you. If he hadn't, you'd be in a lot worse shape. Rex glared at her. He's just some. He's not just anything, Lila snapped. He's a former Special Forces operative. One of the best. The bikers froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Jack sighed, running a hand over his face. He didn't like the attention, but there was no avoiding it now. Look, Lila said, addressing both Jack and the bikers. Let's end this before it gets worse. Rex, take your crew and leave. Now. Rex opened his mouth to argue, but one look from Lila silenced him. He gritted his teeth and motioned for his crew to follow. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring as they sped away. Lila turned back to Jack. Sorry about that, she said again. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. Thanks for stepping in. She studied him for a moment. You've got a lot of patience, she said. Jack shrugged. Not much choice these days. Lila smirked, then turned and walked away, leaving Jack alone once more. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack sat back on the bench, picking up the breadcrumbs. He tossed a few to the ducks, his calm demeanor returning. But beneath the surface, Jack knew this wasn't the end. The bikers would be back. And next time, they wouldn't come alone. The air around the park grew thick with unease as the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance. Jack remained on the bench, his calm exterior betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. He had been in situations far worse than this, yet something about today left him unsettled. It wasn't the bikers themselves. He'd dealt with bullies and thugs before. It was the way Rex had looked at him before leaving, the promise of retaliation simmering in his eyes. Jack had seen that look too many times to dismiss it. The families who had been watching began to trickle back into the park, but the atmosphere wasn't the same. Parents kept a closer watch on their kids, and joggers avoided the area near Jack's bench. He didn't mind the space. In fact, he preferred it. But as he fed the ducks, his thoughts wandered back to Lila's words. Special Forces operative. One of the best. The memories flooded back, unbidden years spent in the military, missions that had taken him to the darkest corners of the world, and decisions that still weighed on his conscience. Jack had left that life behind for a reason. Or at least, he thought he had. As the last of the breadcrumbs disappeared, Jack stood and stretched. He glanced toward the parking lot, half expecting the bikers to return. But the space was empty, the earlier roar of engines replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jack turned and began walking along the park's winding path. The sounds of laughter and conversation returned, though they seemed more cautious than before. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The park had thinned out, with only a handful of visitors lingering. Jack was preparing to leave when he heard it again, the low rumble of motorcycles. He paused mid-step, his instincts kicking in. This time, the sound was louder, heavier, and accompanied by more than just 5 bikes. Jack turned toward the parking lot, his eyes narrowing as a dozen motorcycles pulled in, their riders clad in the same leather jackets bearing the flaming skull emblem. At the front of the pack was Rex, his scarred face twisted into a triumphant smirk. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him rode a massive man with a beard that reached his chest, his jacket adorned with additional patches that marked him as someone of importance. The man dismounted, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. He surveyed the park with cold, calculating eyes before his gaze landed on Jack. Rex wasn't kidding, the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. You've got some nerve standing up to my boys. Jack tilted his head slightly. And you are? Name's Bear, the man said, crossing his arms. I run the Iron Reapers. You caused a lot of trouble for my crew today. Jack gave a small shrug. I didn't start it. Bear chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Doesn't matter. Around here, you don't cross the Reapers and walk away. Jack glanced around, noting the positioning of the bikers. They'd spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around him. Their stance wasn't just for intimidation, they were preparing for something more. I'm not looking for trouble, Jack said, his tone calm but firm. I just want to go home. Bear's smirk widened. That's not how this works, old man. You see, when someone embarrasses my crew, we have to set an example. Otherwise, people start thinking we're weak. Jack sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. You're making a mistake. Rex stepped forward, emboldened by the presence of his boss. The only mistake was letting you off easy earlier. Let's see how tough you really are. Before Jack could respond, two of the bikers lunged at him. Unlike earlier, these men moved with more coordination, their attacks more deliberate. They weren't amateurs, they'd been in fights before. But Jack was faster. The first biker swung a crowbar, aiming for Jack's ribs. Jack sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The crowbar clattered to the ground as the biker cried out in pain. Jack followed up with a quick elbow to the man's temple, sending him sprawling. The second biker came at him with a knife, slashing wildly. Jack stepped back, narrowly avoiding the blade. He grabbed a nearby trash can lid, using it as an improvised shield to deflect the next strike. With a calculated move, he disarmed the man and sent him crashing to the ground with a well-placed kick. The other bikers hesitated, their confidence wavering. But Bear's voice cut through the tension. Don't just stand there. Take him down. The remaining bikers surged forward, attacking in pairs. Jack moved like a seasoned fighter, his every motion efficient and purposeful. He used the terrain to his advantage, maneuvering around benches and trees to keep his attackers off balance. One by one, the bikers fell. Some groaned in pain, clutching their injuries, while others stayed down, unwilling to face Jack again. As the dust settled, only Jack and Bear remained standing. The leader of the Iron Reapers stared at Jack, his expression unreadable. You're better than I thought, Bear said, rolling his shoulders. But let's see how you handle someone your own size. Bear stepped forward, his movements deliberate. Unlike the others, he didn't rush in recklessly. He sized Jack up, looking for weaknesses. The two men circled each other, the tension between them palpable. Jack knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. Bear wasn't just strong, he was experienced. Bear struck first, throwing a powerful punch aimed at Jack's jaw. Jack blocked it, but the force sent him staggering back a step. Bear pressed the advantage, delivering a series of heavy blows that Jack narrowly avoided. Jack countered with a quick strike to Bear's ribs, but the larger man barely flinched. Bear swung again, this time catching Jack on the shoulder. Jack grunted in pain but stayed on his feet. The fight continued, both men exchanging blows. The bikers who were still conscious watched in stunned silence, their earlier bravado replaced with awe. Finally, Jack saw an opening. Bear overextended on a punch, leaving his side exposed. Jack stepped in, delivering a precise strike to Bear's solar plexus. The larger man staggered, gasping for air. Jack followed up with a sweep kick, taking Bear's legs out from under him. Bear hit the ground hard, the impact echoing through the park. Jack stood over him, breathing heavily. It's over, he said, his voice firm. Bear glared up at him but didn't move to get up. He knew he'd lost. Jack turned to the rest of the bikers, his gaze cold. You tell anyone who asks, this park isn't your playground anymore. If I see you here again, we won't stop at words. The bikers nodded quickly, scrambling to help their leader to his feet. Bear grunted in pain but didn't protest as they guided him toward the motorcycles. As the engines roared to life and the gang retreated into the night, Jack let out a long breath. The park was quiet once more, the only sound the chirping of crickets. Jack picked up the trash can lid and set it back in place before heading toward the exit. He knew this wasn't the last he'd see of the Iron Reapers, but for now, the park was safe. And for Jack, that was enough. Rex wiped the blood from his lip, glaring at Jack with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His pride, more than his body, had taken the first hit. He staggered to his feet, his hands clenched into trembling fists. "You think this is over?" Rex snarled, spitting on the ground. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jack's expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, observing every twitch of Rex's muscles. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he replied. "The question is, do you?" Rex roared and lunged again, this time wielding a chain he had yanked from his belt. It whipped through the air with a metallic hiss, aiming for Jack's head. Jack leaned back, narrowly avoiding the strike, and grabbed the chain mid-swing. With one fluid motion, he yanked it from Rex's grip and coiled it around his hand. Rex stumbled forward, off balance, and Jack delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs. The larger man hit the ground with a grunt, gasping for air. The gang hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Rex was their leader, their symbol of strength, and he was on the ground. Still, they couldn't let this insult go unpunished. One by one, they stepped forward. The first biker swung a crowbar, aiming for Jack's knees. Jack shifted his weight, dodging effortlessly. He caught the man's wrist and twisted it, forcing him to drop the weapon. With a sharp jab to the chest, the biker collapsed, wheezing. Two others charged together, one wielding a knife and the other a bat. Jack stepped into the space between them, deflecting the knife with the chain still wrapped around his hand. He ducked under the bat, grabbed its wielder by the jacket, and hurled him into his partner. Both crashed to the ground in a heap. The fourth biker hesitated, his confidence wavering as he watched his comrades fall. But a shout from Rex, "Get him, you idiot!" spurred him into action. He raised a pair of brass knuckles, his face set with determination. Jack didn't wait. He closed the distance with startling speed, disarming the man with a quick strike to the forearm. A spinning kick sent the biker sprawling, his brass knuckles clinking uselessly on the pavement. All eyes turned to Rex, who was struggling to stand. His face was a mask of fury and humiliation. Jack dropped the chain to the ground with a metallic clang. "Still want to try?" he asked, his tone calm but challenging. Rex snarled, grabbing a knife from his boot. "I'm not done with you." He charged, his movements wild and reckless. Jack waited, his stance unchanging, until the last possible moment. As the blade arced toward him, Jack sidestepped and caught Rex's wrist. With a twist and a shove, the knife clattered to the ground, and Rex was pinned against a nearby tree. Jack leaned in, his voice low and steady. "You've already lost. Walk away while you still can." But Rex wasn't listening. His pride wouldn't let him. He pushed against Jack's hold, his strength fueled by desperation. Jack sighed, releasing him abruptly. Rex stumbled, and with one well-placed kick to the back of his knee, Jack sent him collapsing to the ground. The park fell silent except for the groans of the defeated bikers. Jack took a deep breath and looked around. The families and joggers who had been hiding now peeked out from behind trees and benches, their expressions a mix of awe and curiosity. One of the bystanders, a young man in his 20s, stepped forward cautiously. "That was amazing," he said. "Who are you?" Jack hesitated. For years, he had avoided this question, burying his past in the hope of living a quiet life. But today, there was no escaping it. He straightened, pulling off his cap to reveal the steely gaze of a man who had seen too much and survived it all. "My name's Jack Rowe," he said, his voice carrying across the park. "I served in the Special Forces for over 20 years. And all I want is some peace and quiet." The crowd murmured in astonishment. One of the bikers, still lying on the ground, managed to gasp, "Special Forces? No way." Rex groaned, clutching his ribs. "You think you're untouchable," he spat. "We'll come back. You can't take on all of us forever." Jack crouched beside him, his tone low but firm. "If you come back, you won't find me unprepared. And the next time, you won't walk away so easily." Rex glared but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The families and bystanders began to step closer, their initial fear giving way to admiration. "Thank you," a woman said, holding her child close. "You stood up to them when no one else would." Jack nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said simply. The young man from earlier approached again, his eyes wide with excitement. "You're like a real-life hero," he said. "Why don't you train people? Teach them how to defend themselves?" Jack shook his head. "I'm no hero. I've done things I'm not proud of. I just want to live quietly." The crowd didn't seem to care. To them, Jack was a symbol of strength and courage, someone who had stood against the odds and emerged victorious. With Rex barely able to stand, the remaining bikers helped him to his feet. Their swagger was gone, replaced by the grim realization that they had been thoroughly beaten. "This isn't over," Rex muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Jack watched as they limped back to their motorcycles. The engines roared to life, but the sound was less menacing now, more like the whimper of a defeated dog. As they disappeared into the distance, the tension in the park finally lifted. Jack turned back to the pond, where the ducks floated serenely, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded. He retrieved his cap from the ground, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. The crowd began to disperse, though many cast lingering glances his way. Jack didn't acknowledge them. He wasn't looking for thanks or recognition. As he walked away, a child's voice called out, "Mister, are you coming back tomorrow?" Jack paused, glancing over his shoulder. A faint smile played on his lips. "Maybe," he said. And with that, he left the park, the setting sun casting a golden glow on his retreating figure. Behind him, the echoes of the day lingered, a reminder that sometimes, even the quietest among us hold the greatest strength. The crowd that had gathered began whispering among themselves, the tension in the air finally breaking. People exchanged looks of disbelief and relief, their murmurs creating a hum that seemed almost surreal after the chaos. Rex, still crumpled on the ground, coughed and forced himself upright. His pride had taken a beating that hurt far more than his battered body. He stared at Jack, his anger mingled with fear. "You think you're some kind of savior?" Rex growled, his voice hoarse. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crouched down to meet Rex's gaze, his calm demeanor radiating an authority that demanded respect. "Savior?" Jack echoed softly. "No. I'm just a man who's tired of seeing bullies like you think you own the world." Rex's hands clenched into fists, his bravado still refusing to let him admit defeat. "This isn't over," he spat, though his voice wavered. Jack tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "If you come back here or try to hurt anyone again, you won't just have me to deal with. You'll have to face the consequences of your own arrogance." For a moment, Rex held Jack's gaze, but the truth was evident. He had been utterly outmatched. Jack stood and turned his attention to the remaining bikers, who were now helping each other to their feet. "You have a choice," Jack said, addressing them directly. "You can follow him down this path, or you can walk away and be better than this." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. They looked to Rex, who scowled but offered no direction. One by one, they started backing away, their swagger gone, replaced by shame. As the bikers retreated, Jack remained motionless, watching until the last engine faded into the distance. The tension in his shoulders relaxed slightly, but his mind was elsewhere. For years, he had avoided confrontation, retreating into the quiet anonymity of civilian life. He had left behind the world of violence and danger, promising himself that he wouldn't need to use his skills again. But as he looked at the families now returning to the park, their fear replaced with cautious gratitude, Jack couldn't shake the memory of the countless missions where he had protected others. His purpose had always been to shield the innocent, even if it came at great personal cost. A boy no older than 7 approached Jack hesitantly, clutching a soccer ball to his chest. His mother hovered nearby, her eyes wary but thankful. "Sir," the boy said, his voice small but steady. "That was really cool. Are you a superhero?" Jack chuckled softly, the sound almost foreign to his ears after the intensity of the last hour. He crouched to the boy's level. "No, kid," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm just someone who doesn't like to see bad guys win." The boy grinned, and Jack ruffled his hair before standing. As Jack began to walk away, several bystanders tried to approach him, their gratitude spilling over in a flurry of words. "Thank you for stepping in. You saved us all. Who are you really?" Jack raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I'm nobody special," he said. "Just a guy who wants to live his life in peace. That's all." One man, a local shopkeeper Jack recognized from his weekly trips into town, spoke up. "We could use more men like you around here. Someone to stand up to these punks when they think they can do whatever they want." Jack shook his head. "The world doesn't need more people like me," he said. "It needs people who stand together and say, 'Enough. You don't have to fight like I do.' Sometimes, all it takes is courage to speak up." As Jack left the park, the scene he left behind was anything but ordinary. Families slowly returned to their spots, resuming their picnics and games. Children laughed again, their joy replacing the fear that had gripped the park only moments before. But the bikers' defeat had left a mark. The people of Greenfield Park had seen something that would linger in their minds, a reminder that even the seemingly ordinary could possess extraordinary strength. Jack, however, didn't feel like a hero. As he reached the edge of the park, he paused by a water fountain, splashing cool water on his face. His reflection stared back at him, tired but resolute. He thought about Rex's parting words, the thread hanging in the air. It wasn't over, not entirely. Men like Rex rarely let things go. Jack made a mental note to stay vigilant. The peace he sought came with its price, and today had proven that he couldn't fully escape the man he once was. But if his skills could keep even one person safe, perhaps they weren't such a curse after all. For now, though, the park was safe. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the pond. The ducks quacked softly, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. Jack adjusted his cap and started down the path leading back to his modest apartment. As he walked, he caught sight of the young boy with the soccer ball, now playing with his friends. The boy waved at him enthusiastically, and Jack returned the gesture with a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need thanks or recognition. The satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing was enough. By the next day, whispers of what had happened at Greenfield Park spread throughout the town. The story grew with each retelling, painting Jack as an enigmatic figure, a guardian who had appeared out of nowhere to protect the innocent. Jack, meanwhile, returned to his routine, hoping the attention would fade. But deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. The events of that day had set something in motion, something he couldn't quite put into words. And as much as he wanted to avoid it, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if the world needed someone like him after all. The sharp wail of sirens sliced through the air, growing louder by the second as the park ranger, already alerted by a witness, pulled up with a squad car behind him. The loud engines of the motorcycles, which had once filled the park with their intimidating roar, were now silent. The bikers, once so confident and threatening, stood in stunned silence as the police officers moved quickly to restrain them. Rex, the leader, still holding onto his anger, was handcuffed and shoved into the back of a police car, but the fire in his eyes was now replaced by a bitter realization: the park had not just been Jack's battleground, but his downfall. The other bikers, too, were rounded up one by one. Their tough guy attitudes had evaporated, and the sight of them being carted away, shoulders slumped in defeat, seemed almost surreal compared to the aggressive scene only minutes before. They were no longer the predators, but the prey, held accountable for their actions. Jack didn't stick around to see it all unfold. He had no interest in watching the law take over, nor did he need any more drama than he had already dealt with. He didn't want recognition, didn't need the glory that came with taking down a gang. Instead, he returned to his spot on the weathered bench by the pond, quietly retrieving his bag of breadcrumbs. The ducks, blissfully unaware of the conflict that had just erupted around them, continued to paddle lazily across the water. Jack scattered the crumbs, each piece floating gently on the breeze before settling into the calm pond below. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few minutes lifting from his shoulders. The families who had gathered to witness the chaos now looked on with a different sense of gratitude. Where there had been fear, there was now relief. A few lingering onlookers began to clap. It wasn't a huge crowd, but enough for Jack to hear the soft sound of appreciation. The clapping grew louder, more sincere, and soon the park felt less like a battleground and more like the peaceful haven it was meant to be. Jack sat still, not acknowledging the applause. He didn't need their thanks. To him, it was enough that the day had ended without anyone getting seriously hurt. It was enough that people could enjoy the park again without looking over their shoulders. As Jack reached into his bag to pull out another handful of breadcrumbs, a little boy approached him. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with wide eyes and an expression of complete awe. His mother watched from a distance, her eyes filled with both curiosity and caution, as though she wasn't quite sure if Jack was someone she should be wary of. But the boy, undeterred by any hesitations his mother might have, stood confidently in front of Jack. "Mister, are you a superhero?" the boy asked, his voice filled with pure wonder. Jack paused for a moment, his hand mid-air as he prepared to toss the breadcrumbs. He looked at the boy, studying his innocent face. The kid's question was simple, but it carried with it a sincerity that struck a chord deep within him. Jack couldn't help but smile as he ruffled the boy's messy hair. "Nah, kid," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm just someone who believes in standing up for what's right." The boy's face lit up with admiration, and he nodded vigorously. "That's still pretty cool," he said, a grin spreading across his face. Jack chuckled and returned the smile. He felt a brief flash of pride, but quickly pushed it aside. This moment, this small interaction, was enough to remind him of why he had fought. Not for recognition, not for glory, but because he believed in something greater than himself. He believed in protecting others, in making sure that those who couldn't defend themselves had someone willing to stand in their corner. The boy ran back to his mother, who gave Jack a grateful nod before gently pulling him away. The crowd around Jack began to disperse as well, families returning to their activities and picnics. A few lingering looks were cast his way, but the tension that had filled the park earlier was long gone. It had been replaced with a sense of calm that felt almost surreal, as though everything that had happened was part of some strange dream. Jack stood up, his knees creaking slightly as he stretched. The park was returning to its usual rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt that peace settling over him. But there was still something inside him that didn't feel fully at ease. The fight with the Iron Reapers had been necessary, but it had also reminded him of how close to the edge he could be. He had spent years trying to put that side of himself behind him, to forget the man he once was. But today, the past had come rushing back, and Jack couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before someone or something else would drag him back into the conflict. He took a few steps away from the bench, heading toward the park's exit. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the path. The cool evening air felt refreshing after the heat of the day. Jack walked slowly, lost in thought, but the sound of footsteps approaching from behind made him pause. Turning around, he saw a figure jogging toward him. It was the park ranger, a younger man with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Hey, sir," the ranger called out as he approached. "I just wanted to thank you for stepping in. You really saved us all back there." Jack nodded, his expression neutral. "Just doing what needed to be done," he replied quietly. The ranger hesitated, as though trying to find the right words. "I don't know what you used to do, but it's clear you've got some skills. We need more people like you around here." Jack glanced at him briefly, then gave a small shake of his head. "No one needs people like me," he said, his voice tinged with a touch of sadness. "The world just needs people who will do the right thing when it matters." The ranger didn't press the issue. He simply nodded. "Well, thank you again. If you ever need anything, if you ever want to talk, don't hesitate to come by the station." Jack offered a brief smile, but his mind was already elsewhere. "I'll keep that in mind." As the ranger walked off, Jack turned his attention back to the park. The peace that had returned felt like something fragile, something that could be easily broken. He knew better than most that trouble didn't announce itself, it came quietly, creeping up when least expected. He continued his walk toward the exit, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. There was no more applause, no more praise. Just the quiet hum of the world moving on. Jack was okay with that. He didn't need the attention. He had done what he set out to do, and that was enough. He reached the park's entrance and stopped for a moment, taking in the sight of the setting sun. The light reflected off the calm surface of the pond, casting a golden glow over the park. The day had ended, but Jack knew that tomorrow would come, and with it, new challenges, new opportunities to do what was right. Jack adjusted his cap and stepped out of the park, his hands shoved into his pockets. The world had a way of moving forward, whether you were ready or not. But Jack Rowe was ready. He had always been ready. And if the world needed him again, he would be there. Because some things, no matter how much you try to leave them behind, never truly go away. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jack sat quietly on the park bench, watching the ducks glide gracefully across the water. Their calm movements mirrored the peace that seemed to have returned to the park, a peace Jack had fought for without hesitation. The shadows stretched long across the pond, and the evening breeze carried a gentle chill, signaling the end of the day. Despite the chaos that had unfolded only hours ago, the world around him now seemed still, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. Jack's fingers grazed the edge of the bench, his eyes narrowing slightly as he gazed at the orange and pink hues stretching across the sky. He felt the weight of everything that had happened, yet it didn't feel heavy. The fight, the tension, the moments of fear, it all felt distant now. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to enjoy the peace. A rare smile tugged at his lips, but it wasn't the kind of smile that came from joy or happiness. No, it was something different. It was a smile born from understanding, from knowing that sometimes, peace didn't come easily, it had to be earned. And Jack had earned it today. He leaned back slightly, eyes still on the water, the soft ripples reflecting the fading light. His mind, however, wasn't entirely focused on the ducks or the setting sun. No, his thoughts were much deeper than that. They traveled back to his years in the Special Forces, the training, the missions, the countless hours spent preparing for situations just like the one he had faced today. He'd never asked for the life he had, but it had shaped him. It had taught him something important, something that many people never learned: how to be prepared for anything, even when everything seemed calm. Jack wasn't a hero. He wasn't the kind of person who went around looking for trouble. He had walked away from his old life, put it behind him as best as he could. But there was one thing he had never lost: the ability to protect others, to stand up when no one else would. As the sun sank lower, Jack's smile faded slightly, replaced by the familiar stoicism he carried with him. He had never sought recognition. He wasn't someone who wanted praise or attention. He didn't need it. The only thing he wanted was to live quietly, to move through life without the noise of conflict. But sometimes, life had other plans. The events of the day had reminded him of that truth. Even in the most peaceful of places, there was always the possibility of disruption. Trouble didn't always announce itself. It didn't come with flashing lights or loud warnings. It was silent, subtle, creeping into lives when people were least expecting it. That's how it had been with the bikers. They had shown up unannounced, threatening the calm of the park, unaware of who they were messing with. And Jack had stopped them, not with brute force, but with the skill and discipline he had learned over a lifetime. He glanced at his hands, the rough skin of his palms telling stories of years spent in training and combat. They were the hands of a man who had seen things others would never understand. The scars, the calluses, they all told a story of resilience, of a man who had faced death, who had been pushed to the edge, and who had come back stronger because of it. But that wasn't the only thing those hands had done. They had also built, they had protected, and they had fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And that was what Jack took pride in. It wasn't the medals or the recognition, it was knowing that he had made a difference when it mattered most. A gentle breeze swept across the park, rustling the leaves of the trees, and Jack closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the sounds of nature to wash over him. It was moments like this that reminded him of why he had chosen the quiet life. The hustle, the violence, the constant need for action, it wasn't who he was anymore. He had found peace in the stillness of the world, in the simplicity of watching the ducks swim, in the warmth of the sun as it slowly disappeared behind the horizon. But even in this peace, Jack knew that life wasn't always that simple. There would always be those who sought to disrupt it, those who wanted to take advantage of others, to bully and intimidate. And Jack couldn't ignore that. He couldn't stand by while others suffered. The truth was, sometimes the most dangerous people weren't the ones who sought out fights. They weren't the ones who walked around with a chip on their shoulder, looking for a reason to cause trouble. No, the most dangerous people were the ones who didn't look for fights but knew exactly how to end them when they came. Jack wasn't proud of what he had done today, at least not in the way people might think. He didn't enjoy hurting others, didn't get a rush from violence. But he knew that sometimes, it was necessary. He had stood up because no one else had. He had made sure that the park remained a safe place for families, for kids to play without fear. He had done what needed to be done. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about showing off or gaining recognition. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard, even when it required sacrifice. And that, in Jack's mind, was the true measure of strength, not the ability to fight, but the ability to stand firm, to make the hard decisions when everyone else was too afraid to. Jack stood up from the bench, stretching his back as he adjusted his cap. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving behind a darkened sky dotted with stars. He took one last look at the park, taking in the serenity that now blanketed the area. The night was quiet, peaceful again. He began walking slowly toward the park's exit, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. The world would keep turning, he knew. And while there would always be darkness lurking in the corners of life, there would also be light, small moments of peace, of people standing up for what was right, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things when it mattered most. Jack knew that no matter where he went or what came next, he would always be ready. Because he wasn't a hero. He wasn't anything special. He was just a man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. And in a world that often seemed to forget what that meant, Jack Rowe was a reminder that sometimes, the quietest person in the room held the most power. And those who judged by appearances, they were the ones who never saw it coming.